Welcome to another Technique and Composition mini lecture. This one is going to cover both sets 4 and set 5. The reason for that is set 5 is a little weird and is kind of split between technique-specific things regarding shutter speed, in which the composition doesn't matter so much, and a composition type photo regarding depth, layers, and framing, in which the mode doesn't really matter so much. I'll begin by just talking about the composition stuff for both because it's just a little easier. Set 4 covers movement in lines, and when you're studying movement in lines, there are kind of 4 things you want to look for. The 2 big ones are curves. You see this like strong curve here. When you have curves, the eye is just going to want to follow them. And then the other big one is diagonals. And again, when there are diagonals, the eye is going to want to follow them. So in photography and in design, movement doesn't necessarily mean something is literally moving, though it could. It generally has to do with the movement of the eye and the photographer's ability to control it, to lead the eye forward and backward throughout the frame, or to lead the eye throughout the frame. Here we have something that kind of works in like a pure S-curve, which essentially means that you are forcing the viewer's eye as they trace that curve to go from corner to corner to corner to corner. Down here, up here, down here, up here. So sometimes it's about maximizing the space and the real estate of the photo. Other times it's about leading your eye towards something specific. And still other things, it's just about that movement feeling dynamic. So here we don't have anything specific the eye is being led toward, but it sure is fun to get there. The other 2 big ones, in addition to curves and diagonals, number 1 would be things spreading out. So this same situation might look sort of interesting if it was like taken, sort of more statically head on from the outside and all of these spaces were equal in between these bars. But here, because they're like getting smaller and smaller and because these strong lines are spreading out, it feels even more dynamic. It's like space that you're inviting your viewer to just kind of look into. The other big one, and this is happening here as well as in most of the examples, is rhythm. When you have rhythm, you might think, well, that would oppose the feeling of movement, but no. We humans are a rhythmic species, our heartbeat. So we love it, and we're going to have a tendency to want to, again, kind of trace these lines back in space. Rhythm is, again, a principle of design. Anytime you're looking at something and you imagine running your hand across it and it going blip, 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 there's rhythm there. So it's like the visual version of the same term in music. That's movement. We see, again, a lot of examples of that. The set 5 has to do with depth, layers, and framing. Depth, layers, and framing, in this case, should be thought of as kind of all working together. What that means is depth, first of all, doesn't mean psychological depth. We'll get there. But it means, again, the space in the photo. And when you're taking a photo of a brick wall, it's probably going to be less engaging than if there is some space in the photo. So giving some depth, some distance. It's cheesy, but if you imagine your viewer is going to walk into the photo, then, that's going to be more engaging for them. So depth can be better achieved through layers. Layers can be broken down simply into foreground, something that is close, middle ground, something that's noticeably sort of far away, and background, anything that's way further away than that. So the fact is, if I have a photograph of just the sky here, there's plenty of space there. There's plenty of depth, essentially, but that depth isn't reinforced. It just looks like the sky, and it ends up looking kind of flat, even though I'm far away from it. When you have little noticeable details, focal points, whatever you want to call them, that are going back in space, that reinforces the viewer's perception of that space. So that's what I mean when I say layers. I don't mean psychological layers. I mean foreground, middle ground, background, and whatever else. Middle foreground, or middle background, or back middle ground, or whatever. And finally, framing, which is happening in most of these, is the idea that sometimes you can use one of those elements, foreground, middle ground, or background, to essentially frame in on the subject. So it's not like printing out your photo and putting it in a frame, but it has a similar effect. It draws more attention to it. It kind of clarifies edges and clarifies, this right here, this is what this is all about. This is why you're looking at this. So again, it's just when it surrounds it on at least two sides, like you see here with this Ansel Adams photograph, if not more than that. Sometimes you could even say it's very literal. So that's depth, layers, and framing. And when you take that picture, you're going to want to make sure that you are involving all of those things. So that brings us to aperture and shutter speed, which are the technique aspects of sets 4 and 5. I'll touch on shutter speed briefly. It is something that we're going to do together in class. You don't have to do it on your own. If you are absent that day, then it's probably a better idea for you to just talk to me about what we did. Shutter speed is, inside the camera there is this thing called a shutter. And really, we already knew that from pinhole photography. You had a shutter on your pinhole picture. It was the thing that opened and closed, allowing light to go into the pinhole. Shutter speed in a regular camera, there is a similar kind of thing that covers either the film or the photosensitive element of a digital camera, the sensors. And that shutter smacks open and smacks closed, and the space between open and close is essentially your exposure time, or in other words, the shutter speed. Typically, that's happening in a fraction of a second. In fact, faster shutter speeds might include 1/2500th of a second or 1/4000th of a second, meaning you are taking a picture that is only lasting the amount of time that it takes for you to divide 1 second into 4,000 pieces, and it's just one of those pieces. So in that case, that means you better have really bright light, and it also means that it's going to freeze time. In class, we'll go outside and jump up and down and take pictures and try to get a picture that looks like we're levitating. The reverse of that is slow shutter speed, in which we tend to blur motion. So if I just kind of type that into Google, in fact, here I'll type highway at night. So these photos, we do something similar to this in class using lightsabers in the gym, where I turn off all the lights, and we don't fight, so don't worry if you miss it. We didn't fight, but we ended up with some pretty cool photos that are similar to these streaks of light, because we have a dark situation and a slow shutter speed. And when we do it in the gym, we tend to do it over the course of about 5 to 8 seconds. So fast and slow shutter speed are part of what determines exposure. And there are kind of three things that determine exposure. The big ones are shutter speed and aperture, and then there's a sort of secondary one that we won't get into too much right now called ISO, which is essentially the sensitivity of the sensors inside your camera. So shutter speed is the amount of time that light is allowed into the camera. Aperture is the other part of this, and the aperture stuff you're going to have to do on your own. Aperture is a piece of the lens. It is inside the lens. This is kind of a low-quality image, but it is an irising hatch inside the lens that will open or close, not completely, because it allows more or less light at a time to get into the camera. So in other words, aperture is light by volume, how much light at a time. Shutter speed is light by time, or in other words, how much time. It's a little hard to explain, but you might kind of pick up on the idea that these two things are intimately linked. In other words, if I have a picture that is using a fast shutter speed, like right up here, 1/1000th of a second, then in order for that to turn out, in order for that picture to turn out, I either have to have a lot of light in that situation, because it says here it's going to tend to be darker, or I have to adjust my aperture to fit that. And when you put your camera into for instance, aperture priority, which on our camera is AV mode, it's going to change the aperture, but it's also going to change the shutter speed to fit that, whereas manual is going to let you do whatever you want with either one, even if it's not ideal. So it's harder to explain than it is for you to just kind of tinker with it and see it. But basically, a faster shutter speed means you're going to need the aperture to be open. In other words, if you're not letting in light over very much time, then you're going to need to let in a lot of light at once, which means the aperture is wider. Versus if you are doing a really slow shutter speed, you're going to tend to want the aperture to be more closed if you're in an average lighting situation, because you don't want to let in too much light and flood the exposure. ISO, again, is like sort of a secondary thing. The reason I say it's secondary is because aperture and shutter speed also both have a unique visual effect. The visual effect of shutter speed is having to do with motion. It's either going to freeze motion or blur motion over time. So a fast shutter speed will freeze motion, a slow shutter speed will blur it. Aperture has a different visual effect, and I'll end by explaining that. But I should say for now that the reason I say ISO is secondary is because ISO, the visual effect, if you go higher with your ISO versus lower, lower is kind of almost always ideal because higher is going to tend to have more noise and grain. Which isn't necessarily something you want. So in other words, with aperture shutter speed, there might be reasons that you would in fact want frozen motion or blurred motion. There might be instances with aperture where you would want a wide aperture or a narrow aperture. To get into what aperture does, it works kind of in conjunction with the curvature of the lens and the photosensitive elements and everything. It essentially makes it so that if it's open, you have to specify to the camera and to the lens what you want it to focus on. If it's closed, that becomes less important because it being closed kind of automatically chooses certain wavelengths of light. Or in other words, aperture is responsible for depth of field. Now here's where things get really confusing with aperture. Aperture is measured by f-stop. And a smaller number with the f-stop, that does directly correspond with the depth of field. In other words, if you look here, this is showing an f-stop, or in other words, an aperture that is lower, and therefore there is a lower depth of field. We see this pair up front is relatively clear. This one is really blurry. When that number gets raised and when the number gets raised, the aperture is essentially closing, which is what's weird to people. And in this case, with the higher number, we have more in focus, or a longer or higher depth of field. So yeah, what gets confusing is people tend to think that a large number should mean that it's open, and a small number should mean that it's closed, and the reverse is true. So if you just kind of think about like optically how light is going to work going through that space, when it goes through that large space, the lens has to kind of move around and correct and figure out what you're trying to focus specifically on. So you see the light kind of going through the lens and bending back, and kind of working with the curvature of the lens as it moves back and forth. When you have the irising hatch or the aperture, when you have that closed, less of the curvature of the lens is involved, and it doesn't have to be as picky about, and you don't have to be as picky about what you're focusing on, because everything's going to be in focus, which is why with a pinhole camera, everything is in focus as long as you're perfectly still, because that small little opening, there is no lens, but you have this teeny tiny opening that is only capturing a sliver of light. Which makes the image nice and sharp no matter what it's pointing at. To see that in action with some of the class cameras, first of all, we have the class DSLR, and we actually have a portrait lens for it. This image is a little dark. But here we have it with a high aperture mode, and you see this is nice and sharp right up front. And this stuff back here it's maybe a tiny bit blurry, but you can still sort of see what's going on. Versus this image, where the background has completely melted into nothingness. And this is a pretty extreme version of aperture using a portrait lens, which is like specialized, meant to do this. Even if you look at the doll's face up close, there's such a narrow depth of field that only some of the hair is even in focus. There are like parts of the face that are blurring too. Now, as far as the class cameras that students use, you're going to find generally a much less dramatic change. Which is why, and here are two images. This is a high aperture setting. This is a low aperture setting. When you take your two pictures for low and high aperture, similar to the first two pictures with simplicity and emphasis, where you took the same picture twice with the flash on and the flash off, here you're going to take the same picture twice with a low aperture mode and a high aperture mode. Excuse me. What that means is this. Let's say you start in low aperture. In order to see what it does, because our class camera's lenses are smaller, the aperture is smaller, it's going to be less of a dramatic difference. So here we have a subject right up front, and then we have lots of space in the background. And if you don't have that, if you don't have a subject right up front in front of the camera and a lot of space back there, you're never going to see what it does. So you have to get this exactly right, or you're going to have to retake your image. In the second one, and I can just, again, click back and forth between them, we see in both of them the frontal subject is relatively clear, but the background is blurry in the low aperture value. In other words, again, the aperture is open, it's got a low depth of field, and it's sharp in the high aperture version. The aperture is closed, and it's got a long depth of field. Okay, that about covers it for aperture and shutter speed, sets 4 and 5. For set 4, you're taking 3 images. The aperture ones, I'm not too concerned about movement in lines, so that's why the third one, I don't care what mode it is, but you're going for S-curve or diagonal with spread and or rhythm. So at least 2 of those things you could try for all 4. And with your aperture pictures, that's less important, although I definitely did it here with this curving line and it's spreading out. But with your aperture pictures, you got to be able to see far into the background with a frontal subject and take the same picture twice so you can see the difference. With set 5, which once again in most cases we do together in class, you're going to take a picture involving depth, layers, and framing, and then a fast shutter speed and a slow shutter speed picture. That pretty much covers everything. The last set is fully manual mode. I will talk about that in one final mini lecture. Otherwise, good luck, and once you have set 5 complete, you are welcome to move on to set 6.